Before we invite the Rabbi to speak, I'd like to invite two ambassadors for the Holocaust Educational Trust who are with us today, Cora Alexander and Beatrice Campbell, and they're going to say, have to speak for about 4 or 5 minutes about lessons from Auschwitz. So can I welcome Cora and Beatrice? Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Cora, and my friend Beatrice and I will be speaking to you today as ambassadors for the Holocaust Educational Trust. We took part in the Lessons from Auschwitz project in 2017 through our school, Sullivan Upper. Through the project, we heard from a survivor, attended a seminar on pre-war Jewish life, and visited the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau. When we returned, we shared our experiences and what we learned with our school. We found the experience incredibly eye-opening and emotional. It is so important to us to ensure that the 6 million innocent men, women and children who perished in the Holocaust are remembered. 4 years ago, we heard survivor Eva Clark share her moving testimony with us in our school. It was an important experience for us. It was the first time our eyes had been opened to the reality of the Holocaust, of what happened to real people like Eva and her family. Her speech back then inspired us to apply to take part in the Lessons from Auschwitz project. What stood out to us about her story was hearing about the difficult experiences of her mother, Anka Nathan, who had incredible emotional and physical endurance and inspiring strength. Something else that struck us was the significance of luck in Eva's story. She was born on a cart outside Mauthausen on the 29th of April 1945 without medical assistance. At this point, Anka was 5 stone and baby Eva was born only 3 pounds. Their survival was miraculous, as was the fact that the gas chambers in Mauthausen ran out of gas on the 28th of April, just 1 day before Eva's birth. Had the chambers been in operation, Eva and her mother would have been killed. American troops liberated the camp just days after Eva's birth, another striking factor in her and her mother's survival. Eva's bravery to tell her story to us, as she does every year in our school and in schools all across the UK, was so moving, and it really demonstrates the importance of remembering individual stories. Stories such as Eva's help us remember that the people who were murdered in the Holocaust were real people, not simply statistics for which we should cite. We learned that the Holocaust was not the murder of 6 million individuals, it was 6 million individual murders. Only when we realise this can we truly ensure the Holocaust never happens again. Hearing the testimonies of survivors like Eva Clark is important for other reasons. We may be the last generation to hear survivor stories firsthand. The Holocaust Educational Trust say that they believe survivor testimony is at the heart of Holocaust education, and we agree. Soon, young people like myself and everyone around the world will only learn about the Holocaust through textbooks, videos and statistics, not from talking in person to someone who went through it. Therefore, it is hugely important that we continue to share these real stories. It is our collective duty to ensure that we do. I encourage everyone here today to listen closely to survivors' testimonies if they get the opportunity. I cannot overstate its importance. Now, Beatrice will speak about the importance of the Lessons from Auschwitz project.
Arriving at Auschwitz I in March of last year, I think we all felt nervous. None of us were completely sure how we were going to react. When we saw images of the infamous gates reading Arbeit macht frei, translated as work will set you free, it's easy to become emotionally desensitized and dissociate from the horror of what the Holocaust really was. It was interesting to see the range of responses from the members in our group. Some felt very emotionally overwhelmed from the minute they arrived. Others went quiet in disbelief. And for me, like a few others, I felt angry, incredibly angry. I could not and still cannot believe that such an atrocity was humanly possible. When you see the site for yourself, it genuinely is nothing like the pictures that we see and sources that we analyse in class. It's real and it's frightening to think that human beings, not just one evil man, but millions of people were partakers and bystanders in the Holocaust. There are 2 moments that stand out to me as being particularly poignant. The first was an area of Auschwitz I, beside the crematoria, where the house of Commandant Rudolf Hess was positioned. It was there that he and his family lived a completely normal life. His family lived happily and healthily, while innocent men, women and children were dying 100 metres away. The tour guide spoke to us candidly about how part of Holocaust remembrance is in not only humanising the statistics of those who died, but also in humanising the perpetrators. After all, if we do not understand why this atrocity happened, we cannot learn from it, and the danger remains of it happening again. We need look no further than the genocides in Rwanda, Serbia, and the ongoing mass murders by extremists in places like Syria to show that our responsibility is still significant. The second moment that I will always remember happened within the gas chamber. When our tour through the chamber was coming to an end, we saw a group of Jewish students kneeling and praying at the walls. They could not have been much older than us, and they were crying, draped in the flag of the Star of David. We were shocked by the severity and honesty of our visit, but for that group of students, it was their faith, their communities, perhaps even their relatives who perished. It's important that we never let anyone be targeted for who they are. It could be said that today, the discussion regarding the Holocaust is more relevant than ever across the world. Early recognition of creeping dehumanisation of any race is precisely what we take away from our education of the Holocaust. In the darkness of modern extremism, indifference and intolerance, our generation has the responsibility of defending the truth. In this era of alternative facts, the role of the truth bearer is paramount. I want to play my part in bearing witness, and I don't think this can be done solely in the classroom. We visited London in July of last year to attend the Holocaust Educational Trust Ambassadors Conference in Westminster. It was there that we heard a powerful phrase: "Whomever hears from a witness becomes a witness." We stand before you as having borne witness to the truth and are now proud and passionate ambassadors for that truth. The theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is the power of words. I hope our words today have inspired you and perhaps empowered you to understand your significance in Holocaust remembrance. We cannot change the past, but in exploring it, we can effect change in the future. We are now all ambassadors for the truth. Thank you for listening.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and to PRONI, thank you very much for the invitation. And to our ambassadors, really a very, very powerful, moving message. Amazing.
Here.
I'm going to begin with a very short story, part of a story that was in a magazine recently published. The article is entitled "The Angel of Bergen-Belsen." Sima Rachel Neumann. She passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 97. She was, for a while, in Auschwitz, but then later transferred to Bergen-Belsen. What she did, both in Bergen-Belsen and earlier on in Auschwitz, was to try to be some kind of ray of hope, an introduction of humanity in the surrounds of the complete opposite of humanity, where humanity was caused to disappear. A short extract from this article reads as follows. Despite the constant terror and fear, Sima Rachel stole into the camp kitchen time and time again to bring food to the starving, emaciated girls in the barracks. Eventually, she was caught red-handed. The furious Block Elster warned her that if she would sneak into the kitchen again, she would pour soiled water from the latrines on her head. Undeterred, Sima Rachel stole into the kitchen again, risking her life to save her starving sisters. She was caught and endured the punishment readily. When the Block Elster caught her a third time, she marveled at her determination and no longer punished her. This is one story out of thousands of stories of people that have been incarcerated in very many places. And I wouldn't want, although we're going to focus on the Holocaust, I wouldn't want for a moment that the advantage that we have of 2020 vision, events that took place in the past, I wouldn't want to narrow it down only to the Jewish community. I would want that we would see it, that everywhere where dehumanizing takes place, that we should stand up and be a voice and say, this is not right. And as a short anecdote, I have here a picture which, it's a small picture. I will leave it here so people afterwards can come and see the picture. I'll describe the picture to you. It is a window scene. At the front of the window scene, from the house from which this picture was taken, is a Chanukiah, a menorah, used for the festival of Hanukkah, where lights are lit. It doesn't really matter why, but it's an ancient Jewish tradition that at Hanukkah we light lights. We remember events of the past which were equally as terrible. And in the background there is a building outside of which flies the Nazi swastika flag. And the caption at the bottom reads as follows. This photograph was taken in 1931 in the city of Kiel in Germany, shortly before the Nazi Party came to power. The menorah is in the home of Rabbi Akiva Baruch Posner, which faced the Nazi Party meeting hall. Rachel, the rabbi's wife, took the photo and wrote on the back of it, and I quote, "Their flag sees the death of Yehuda," Yehuda referring to Israel. "But Yehuda shall survive, and our light shall outlive their flag." Again, I feel that this is first of all, it's a poignant picture, and if we think that it was taken in 1931. Students of history, when asked, what are the dates of the Second World War? It trips off the tongue for Europeans, 1939 to 1945. For Europeans, because other nations joined in later, on whichever side. To start with, I will say as follows, that man's responsibility in the world and his relationship with his fellow man is because he has been created in the image of God. This is a subject that I've spoken about quite a bit. The image of God, what is it, what it means. But we all have our ideas, and we take as a focal point the concept that if we are all, no exception, if we are all created in the image of God, then somebody that comes to destroy another human being is actually in denial of God and taking away what God put in this world, which we call humanity. Focusing on the Jewish part of the Holocaust. And again, I will stress, the Holocaust affected not only Jewish people, but other people too. There have been other Holocausts since, as there were even before that. But you know, the difference between what had gone on in other places at other times that also sought to destroy nations, it was the factory style in which it was done by those perpetrators. The Jewish problem of suffering anti-Semitism did not start in 1939, certainly did not come to an end in 1945. And so therefore, to understand the events, we need to go back in history and see them in context. Jews and Jewish practice, forcing conversions by contrived baptisms and other methods, compelling Jews to live in ghettos and starving them till their only perceived recourse was to attempt to leave the ghetto and throw themselves on the mercy of whoever was in authority in the place and the time, but who generally betrayed them. While at once seeking their conversion, and people think that, well, yes, it was the Christians that tried to convert the Jews. It was the Muslims that tried to convert the Christians, tried to convert the Jews. The Christians tried to convert the Muslims. Judaism is not a proselytizing religion. But if I'm right in my belief, you must be wrong in your belief, so there's no room for the two of us. So I have to overcome you. It's a disease. It really is, it's a disease. So while at once seeking their conversion by denying them civil rights, and on the other hand complaining that they were usurers of the most despicable nature, but yet willing to accept money to finance their empires. I remember as a young child in school learning about William the Conqueror, 1066, and all that. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, the most famous of Jewish commentators, known as Rashi, lived at that time, and I was not aware, because I wasn't taught it at school, that the Jewish community of Troyes and other places were forcibly levied so that they actually financed 50% of William the Conqueror's journey to England and subsequent conquering of England. If you owe a debt to someone from whom you have borrowed money, but then dispose of the lender, you can pocket the change. During a particularly vicious anti-Jewish period for the Jews of Rome, the then Pope promised to intercede on behalf of the Jews in return for financial assistance from the Rothschild Bank. He promised to intercede. He received money and then retracted his help. Faced with such situations, they are seemingly hopeless situations. If in the ghetto people are not safe, then for sure they're not safe outside of the ghetto. I have met many people throughout my short life who have converted from Judaism to a different religion. I have heard of many famous people, artists, composers, poets, authors, who also, statesmen, who also were born Jewish, but converted to a different religion, and are always referred to as a Jew. They won't let us forget. Are we really accepted? If people feel that in order to achieve salvation you need to be a member of a different religious group, but are you really accepted in that group? Or are you always labeled the Jew? I'm sure you are all familiar with the yellow star. Do you know where it came from? This concept of having a yellow badge on a garment. Just a short extract. The practice of wearing the special markings in order to distinguish and humiliate Jews and other non-Muslims in Islam-dominated countries seems to have been introduced by the Umayyad Caliph Umar II in the early 8th century. The practice was reissued and reinforced by Caliph al-Mutawakkil in 847, subsequently remaining in force for centuries. An old document that was found, dating to 1121, gives the following description of decrees issued in Baghdad. 2 yellow badges are to be displayed, one on the headgear and one on the neck. Furthermore, each Jew must hang around his neck a piece of lead with the word Jimmi. Jimmi, a social status given to tolerated infidels. He also has to wear a belt around his waist. The women have to wear one red and one black shoe and have a small bell on their necks or shoes. That's one use of the yellow star. It was not invented by the Nazis. It dates from way before then. But let me give you one other example of the use of this yellow star. In early Catholic medieval Europe, in largely Catholic medieval Europe, Jews and Muslims were required to wear distinguishable clothing in some periods. These measures were not seen as being inconsistent with Sicut Judaism. Please accept. My apologies for my Latin. Although not the first ecclesiastic requirement for non-Christians to wear distinguishable clothing, the Fourth Council of the Lateran, headed by Pope Innocent III, ruled in 1215 that Jews and Muslims must wear distinguishable dress. Canon 68 reads in parts. I won't read all of it. In some provinces, a difference in dress distinguishes the Jews or Saracens from the Christians, but in certain others, such a confusion has grown up that they cannot be distinguished by any difference. The idea of having clothing or a yellow star certainly was not peculiar to the Nazis. It dates back, it was first introduced, as we've learnt, by one particular religious group, and then adopted by a different religious group, but the aims and objects were the same: to ridicule the other. So whilst cornered in ghettos, denied basic human rights, it could only lead to picking on the weak. Picking on the weak means physically as well as whatever comes to hand. The incitement to hatred of the Jews for whatever mishap befell whichever nations entailed beatings and even false accusations of kidnap, murder, and supposed systematic slander against the Christian religion set in the Talmud. I have met colleagues, Catholic, Protestant, who have told me that they have studied Hebrew. They wanted to learn the Hebrew Bible. They wanted to study Talmud. Commendable. But I was able to point out to them in many old books actually a date stamp of the censor, because all Jewish books, since the time of printing, they were all censored by the church. They were censored in two ways. We can see that there's a stamp of approval, but also sections of the Talmud were redacted, thought to be Jewish teachings against Christianity. And I can assure you, having seen these redacted parts, nothing could be further from the truth. So these beatings, these censorings, these were just some of the, well, for what Jews were accused. These were only some of the crimes. The famous ones, of course, the blood libel. Passover time, we make matzah, unleavened bread. And how many people were accused of kidnapping a Christian child who was then bled to death so that the blood could be used in the mixing of the dough for matzah. People actually believed that. Horrendous. Not realizing, of course, or not taking into consideration, or not even considering that the Torah, the Bible, expressly forbids eating blood. Beatings and the like eventually became more and more frequent, more and more severe. But the attempts to stop them were often non-existent. The incited masses rose up against the Jews. I read recently a book. The book was dealing historically with Holocaust type situations, but it didn't start in 1939. It didn't even start in 1933. Not even in 1931, from where we have this picture. But the book dates back to around about 1750 and deals with the situation that was going on in and around the Vatican and the policies that were enacted by various popes since then, and in time led up to the Second World War and all the horrors that came with it. For sure, people who followed influential, dynamic speakers and being told, you know why you are suffering? You are suffering because of the Jews. Some while ago there was an exhibition here put on in PRONI, which was to do with authors with an Irish-Jewish connection. And amongst the pop-up stands that there was one depicting William Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice. And I asked the question, how on earth could Shakespeare know what a Jew was? There weren't any Jews in England at the time. They had been expelled, and they were not reintroduced until 1665. So he was able to draw on typical caricatures of what and who a Jew is. You see, throughout Europe, I know there are people that have aversions to visiting certain countries of Europe. Oh, I can't go to that place because such and such an atrocity happened there. People used to avoid either speaking certain languages that were associated with anti-Semitism, certain countries which were associated with anti-Semitism. But in truth, if we were to adopt that, I kid you not, probably Ireland would be the only place in Europe that I could visit. It was a brief hiccup in Limerick, but we got over it. There was a mini pogrom there, but like I say, it was a hiccup. But compared with European history, like I say, I kid thee not, Ireland was probably the safest place for Jews. Are we familiar with the term pogrom? It's derived from a Russian word meaning a violent riot aimed at massacre or persecution of an ethnic or religious group, particularly one aimed at the Jews. The term entered the English language to describe the 19th and 20th century attacks on Jews in the Russian Empire. Mostly these took place in the Ukraine and Belarus. As an aside, I will mention that my great-great-grandparents escaped from the Ukraine in 1898 with only the loss of 2 bayoneted children and a great-great-grandmother who bore the scar of the bayonet on her face. They made their way to England. In Odessa, in the years 1821 and later in 1859, the pogroms, let me give you some statistics. Between the years of 1881 and 1884, over 200 anti-Jewish riots in the Russian Empire. In Warsaw there was a pogrom in 1881, in Kishinev in 1903, in 1905 in Kiev, 1906 in Bialystok. Believe me, the list goes on. There were, of course, pogroms outside of Russia, in Central and Eastern Europe. In 1190, on the 16th of March in York, the massacre took place at Clifford's Tower in the city of York. It was shortly after then that the Jews were then expelled from England. In 1398, a pogrom began in Prague on Holy Saturday. We can ask a question. Our young ambassadors have come back from a place, and the impression that has been left with them, how does life go on? That was a theme that was used a while ago for Holocaust Memorial Day. But it's not limited to Holocaust Memorial Day. How does life go on after such events, after such tragedies? What are we doing with our 2020 hindsight? Either on an individual basis or in a collective way. There are other ways to be vindictive, certainly to Jews and to other ethnic groups. I call this bullying. How should we treat a bully? But let me give you another word for bullying. Boycott. There is a movement, international movement. They call themselves BDS, boycott and divestment, sanctions. The most illogical and inconsistent form of bigotry invented by individuals with nothing but blind hatred in their hearts and minds. The BDS movement, which has gone into shops here in Northern Ireland, here in Belfast and removed products from shelves, saying that this product comes from Israel, Israel does such and such to the Palestinians, and therefore we should not support them. If they want to take this to the extreme, put away your smartphones. Stop using your laptops. Put away your computers. Take out the chips. And many other inventions too. That is not a solution. Is there an issue over there which needs resolving? Absolutely. Is boycott and divestment a way to do it? Absolutely not. Let me point out to another invention. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, sometimes known as the Protocols of the Meetings of the Learned Elders of Zion. I wonder why learned. They were ignorant. They fantasized. But if you are familiar with this particular work, then let me tell you. It is an anti-Semitic, fabricated text purporting to describe a Jewish plan for global domination. It's a forgery. It was first published in Russia in 1903, translated into multiple languages, and disseminated internationally in the early part of the 20th century. According to the claims made by some of its publishers, the protocols are minutes of a late 19th century meeting where Jewish leaders discussed their goal of global Jewish hegemony by subverting the morals of Gentiles and by controlling the press and the world's economies. The protocols were often used by the Church to spread its anti-Semitic message via official and unofficial publications. I drive a Ford car. Poor old Henry, it's blue. Henry Ford funded the printing of 500,000 copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which were distributed throughout the United States in the early 1920s. Adolf Hitler was a major proponent. It was studied as if it was factual in German classrooms after the Nazis came to power in 1933. And that is despite it having been exposed as fraudulent by the Times of London already in 1921. And I should tell you, it is still widely available today in numerous languages, in print and on the internet, and continues to be presented by some proponents as a genuine document. And incredibly, it is in use to this very day in the propaganda machines of some of the Arab nations. So not only has it been used by Christian groups, but also by Islamic groups too. Can you believe it? Some people have the audacity to claim that it was written by the Jews. The final solution. The final solution of the Jewish question, by inference, is the answer to a question: what to do with the Jews? Why does something need to be done? Where is the source of this deep-rooted hatred? Does it come only from other religions, or does it have another reason? Does it really matter that there should be a reason? Throughout the years, it doesn't seem to matter if there is or is not a reason, valid or otherwise, in order to actively vilify the Jew. What does that mean, to vilify the Jew? Don't allow him land or possession. Borrow from him what he has, and if you can't pay, never mind, just get rid of him. Not allowing Jewish people land or property. So I mentioned that the return of the Jews was allowed into England in 1665. I'll mention his name quietly, Oliver Cromwell. He came to an agreement with somebody called Menashe ben Israel from Holland, who had escaped the persecutions that had gone on in Europe. And so from 1665 onwards, Jews were allowed back in England. However, it wasn't until 1865 that Jewish people were no longer obliged to carry alien cards. I wonder what it's like to have to carry a card that says, "I'm an alien." So these are late events in the history of the Jewish people, with results so horrific that they are actually unfathomable. I think possibly one of the impressions that our ambassadors are left with is how to understand, how to even visualize. Well, can you imagine? Let me ask, do you remember seeing the shoes? There were feet inside those shoes. Some shoes were size 9, 10, 11, and some shoes were tiny. Survival is one thing, but what of the possibility of reconstructing their lives? Just recently, I heard again a talk given by Tommy Reichenthal, a survivor from Bergen-Belsen. The first time I heard him, I still have ringing in my ears his summary at the end of his talk, when he said, and by the way, he was 10 years old when he was taken to Bergen-Belsen. "I don't forget, I don't forgive, but I get on with life." Where does that strength come from? To be able to get on with life. And I want you to know how close to home that is for me, as my wife's mother was a survivor, as was her father. The difference between her mother and her father: her father had been married with a child in 1939 and 1940, but that wife and the child did not survive. So my wife's mother was a second marriage for her father. How did he rebuild his life? I must ask, what was the role of the Christian churches during this Nazi era? Now, I've tried to point out during my talk that the Nazis were not the only ones to try to pursue to the bitter end the Jews. Possibly the difference between the churches and the Nazis was the sheer scale of the persecution. Many church leaders were vehemently against the treatment of the Jews. Some gave shelter at the risk of their lives, and it is true that many forfeited their lives in the protection by concealment of the Jews. Some, however, took in children, supposedly for the duration, but who concealed them afterwards, causing these orphans ultimately to be orphaned from their faith too. I'm not sure what is worse. give one's child away so that it will survive with its parents' heritage, or to have that child survive but have no heritage, or to have a heritage that is enforced upon it. I give thanks to the Almighty that we have turned that corner, in the sense that genuine dialogue and understanding is coming to the fore. I don't remember, as I grew up in the 1960s, hearing about visits to Auschwitz at the scale that they are happening today. And yes, when we hear tales from survivors, we are the last people, the last generation that will hear these tales firsthand. Some of us will have them handed down as part of our family history. Others will need to rely on others who will be able to say, I heard it from first-hand knowledge, from those who experienced. And I've mentioned those members of the Christian faith who risked their lives to save Jewish people. We call them in Hebrew Chasidei Umot HaOlam, righteous Gentiles. At the peril of their lives, they sacrificed also their freedom, not just from the Nazi era, but from before it and since. That again, Chasidei Umot HaOlam, righteous Gentiles, it's not something that existed only between 1939 and 45. It existed even before then. And it exists even now. When you read of events that took place from Arab countries in the 1950s, and you read about Muslims who saved at the peril of their lives Jewish people, it seems that the spark of humanity exists everywhere. If there is anything to encourage, it is that spark of humanity that should become a flame, a light, a beacon. Some of these, Chasidei Umot HaOlam, righteous Gentiles, some of them have been given special mention in memorials to them in Jerusalem, at a place called Yad Vashem. But I am sure that for as many as there are many more whose names are not mentioned there and whose stories have not been told. People who deserve mention. We have various forums for dialogue, to learn to embrace those who are different from each other and to embrace that difference. If there's one thing that I have learnt in my few years here in Northern Ireland, now I understand that there is, I'll be gentle, there is a sectarian issue here. The rumours have even reached me. But I must tell you that my experience of both sides of the sectarian divide, my personal experience is that I have met such nice people, such friendly people, such welcoming people. I don't understand how you don't get on with each other. Allow yourself, ask yourselves permission to be as you are to the stranger, be that to each other. So perhaps our starting point is the commonality between us. hearing that one from another. I began by quoting from the first chapter of the Bible, where we were all created in the image of God, but that we have diverse ways of serving God. That's a good place to start. Although there are diverse ways, we are serving God. Great place to start. But what does that give us? If we do that, then we have hope for the future. We have a methodology for survival. We will have purpose. We believe. We will learn to trust. We know that we do have an obligation to our fellow man, just as we have an obligation to our Creator. Understanding and compassion for those so traumatized that they have either lost it and floundered, or perhaps who had never been awakened to God the Creator, whose deeds are far beyond our comprehension. Possibly one of the most famous questions that I wouldn't dare to begin to answer that came out from the Holocaust. Where was God? I'm just asking the question. I know that there are people that went through that experience and lost their faith. I know that there are people that went through that experience and gained faith. And I know too that there were people, as far as their faith is concerned, that there was no change, that whatever there was before, that's what was at the end. And it is difficult to understand the concept that there are periods throughout history when it seems that God's anger seems to be vented in whatever way. However, therein lies our future. If you'll forgive me, I'd like to bring a small quote from the book of Ezekiel. It's Ezekiel chapter 37. And thou, son of man, prophesy against Gog, and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tuval. And I will turn thee about, and entice thee on, and will cause thee to come up from the far sides of the north, and will bring thee against the mountains of Israel. And I will smite thy bow out of thy left hand, and will cause thy arrows to fall on thy right hand. Thou shalt fall upon the mountains of Israel, thou and all thy bands, and the peoples that are with thee. If you wish, I refer you to Ezekiel chapter 37. It gives quite an overview of end of world type of situations. One can, from such readings, despair. The end of that chapter talks about the valley of the dry bones. If you're familiar with it, then let me explain also. To those maybe a little less familiar, that those dry bones Ezekiel sees as gaining form and, as it were, coming to life. I feel that from events such as the Holocaust, that which was perpetrated in so many camps throughout Europe, not just in Nazi Germany, but in Poland, the Ukraine, and other places too. Did you know that the forest of Babi Yar, where there was one of the largest massacres that took place, it's a picnic site. People take their families and picnic, and they're over mass graves. But just as Ezekiel saw the rebirth, the reforming of these bones, if we use our 2020 vision and learn those lessons from the past, not only will we say never again, not only will we not be indifferent, but we will engage in dialogue. We will learn to embrace the difference and the different. We will appreciate that we are all created in the image of God. And that is what should teach us. That should be our guiding light, so that we can be regenerated, rejuvenated, and we will learn to live with each other in peace. May it be His will that this will come to pass speedily in our days. Thank you.